The midterm elections revealed something far deeper about our culture than most people imagine. The results are getting a lot of attention, and understandably so, but that's not the whole story. There's much to learn from the campaigns, the debates, the speeches, and the lead up, too. The country is facing significant challenges, from inflation to the Russia Ukraine war and many others. But there was something conspicuously missing from the statements of candidates of all parties. Missing was any semblance of political vision or ideology. Is this vacuum any worse than past elections? What does it signify, and why do voters accept it? Today, we'll take a look at some of the philosophical lessons to be drawn from the midterm elections. I'm Elan Journo, and joining me today is my colleague Onkar Ghate. Welcome, Onkar.
Elan.
So I thought we should start by talking a bit about what the scope of our conversation is going to be, because there's a lot of people doing postmortems right now about the midterms. It's wall to wall coverage. So I think just to underscore what's distinctive about our approach here, and I would classify it as it's a philosophical analysis that we want to draw out some of the deeper issues. How do you think of this, and what motivated you to want to dive into this?
Yeah, I think of it as it's a philosophical perspective, a longer term perspective of what's happening in American politics. So it's stepping aside. I mean, people are looking at it from the perspective, and I mean, this is valid, but it's not all there is to the situation of looking at it of what happens normally happens in a president's first term when it's you've got these midterm elections and when his popularity is such and such. Yeah, what normally happens, and so it's viewed as it was a good result for Democrats because it usually the opposing party would sweep more seats than they seem to have gotten. Some are still up in the air. And looking at it ahead for the 2024 election, which is important as well. But it's important as I think it equally to take a longer term view of what's happening in American politics and some of the deeper forces. Both right, well, here I think it's essentially there's negative, deeper forces that are important to pay attention to. That unfortunately, I think they're negative and they're ominous, and that you could see it in the campaigns this year on both sides if you're taking this wider, longer term perspective.
So I wanted to put a few issues on the table that I was really interested in thinking about what's going to happen as a result of the midterms and where different candidates stand on this. I'll just put them all out, and then we can dig into some of them. So one was abortion, I think, which is the biggest issue in many respects because of the decision earlier this year from the Supreme Court knocking down Roe as a precedent. I think inflation, and we were talking earlier about inflation and the pandemic, that the just what how would you approach these issues? What's their salience for people? Energy prices, and this I think of as slightly different from most people. I think of it as the ways in which we're restricting energy production in the United States, which is hobbling our ability to extract and take advantage of energy. And that's part of it is seen in high prices. And then there's some foreign policy issues that were not really discussed. I mean, surprising how little there was of this. So the big one is Russia, Ukraine, another one is Iran, and then another one is China. And they make some appearances, but not at all in the way that I would have expected. And then the final issue, you mentioned this, and I think it's worth, maybe we can start with this. The I'm not sure how to describe it, but I would say that there's this whole climate of questioning the integrity of elections ever since 2020, where the whole steal the vote, and then what happened in January 6th, and how this has been fostered by Donald Trump and many others since then. And this came up as an issue. You mentioned this in the context of Georgia, where there was an outcome that I think was significant. So I'm curious of your thoughts on how these issues figured and didn't figure into the results, and where do you see any bright spots as well?
Yeah, so and in the shorter term, but it has implications for 2024 and beyond that. I was the most encouraging thing for me was the Georgia that Brian Kemp defeated Stacey Abrams, and same at the level of the Secretary of State. So these were people, and if you, I think we talked about this when we did our podcast on January 6th insurrection, or the however you want to term it, that if you listen to the call between Trump and Kemp, and I forget there were others on the call, and the pressure that was being put on Georgia that you should just not certify the vote or do something that they had, and the essence of the situation from their perspective was, we have no evidence for any of this, and yet you want us to do it. And when you listen to that call, I think one of the things that was striking about it and good about it is that they just sounded like Americans, in the sense that, like, you're asking us to do something, you don't provide a shred of evidence for it, and like it would be really wrong to do it, and the politics of the situation didn't matter as much, and um, people on the Democratic side and so on, but just sort of Americans following the political scene, I think rightly saw that as like, that's a good thing. That's part of what it means for someone to put. Let's put it in terms of the kind of oaths they take of putting the Constitution first and so on. And you certainly can, as a government official, do something for which you have absolutely no evidence for, and that the fact that they're Republicans and so on shouldn't matter. What they did was right in that situation. It was important that they did the right thing. And I think any voter who cares about the election system, but also cares about rewarding politicians who do something good, they deserve the vote. And particularly if you think in contrast, say, to Stacey Abrams, I think the positions of Kemp and so on are better as well. But that they didn't, even if someone thinks like, I can't vote Republican or independents looking at it, I think part of what the vote, what it reflects, is some genuine assessment of, and not just well, it's Republican, I'll never vote Republican, so I'm voting for the other candidate, or vice versa. The results were somewhat unexpected, and I think the analysis I've seen that makes sense to me is that the independents acted independently in that sense and supported some of the better candidates if they're Republican, voted against some of the worst candidates if they're Republican, and so in that sense it wasn't so tribal. And I think it was important that in Georgia these two people, they won re-election, because I think they deserved to win re-election.
Yeah, I was surprised, just to turn to a different topic, how little there was on the pandemic. So, in one respect, there was people, I think the governor of Florida campaigned on the fact that he kept the schools open and wasn't as great. And in some ways, I can understand that was, it turned out to be a better policy than what was being done in many other places. But overall, during the pandemic's peak, we were talking a lot with our colleague Onkar. Onkar, you and I were talking with Amish Adalja, who's one of his specialties is that he looks at pandemic preparedness, and one of his critiques during the pandemic and since then has been that America was underprepared, and it was unforgivable given all the knowledge that there is about being prepared for a pandemic. And I've been thinking that there's parallels between that kind of preparedness and military preparedness, which is a pandemic is something that occurs rarely, and thankfully it's very rare. And military confrontations should be rare too, and given where we are as a country, that they are rare. But there's a way in which it's much easier for people to recognize we need to have a military that's strong and ready for anything. Who knows what might come? The pandemic should have taught people that we need similar levels of preparedness. It looks different. It's not bullets and armaments and so on, but we needed a level of preparation for this sort of crisis. And no one's really pushing that. It seemed to me like a winning proposition. Like, if you promise people we'll be in a position where we never, ever have to be locked down the way we were during the pandemic, isn't that a winning proposition? To me, that would be very appealing to me. And all the economic upheavals that went along with the lockdowns. So that seems like a big omission. And I mention it because with our focus today, we're trying to look at a wider perspective, longer range perspective. So part of the worry after the pandemic is, okay, well, that's over. What's next? And no concept of this is a long-term perspective that you have to take towards pandemics. It's not like, well, we'll worry about it next century when it happens again. You need to be in a position to have a view beyond the next election cycle, beyond the next 5 years, so that if something catastrophic happens and something worse than COVID-19 surfaces, you're ready for it. And I'm disappointed that no one's really pushing that position. And I think it's a symptom, or I think it can be read as a symptom of a lack of long range vision politically.
That's the basic lesson or idea that I take from the midterms, and this is in terms of thinking of the longer term political direction of the United States. What I found striking is, so you put it long term political vision. I'm long past thinking that any politician will talk at the level of principles, of political principles, in the way. So, what does it look like to do that? In the way that, say, James Madison or Thomas Jefferson talked about politics, about the Constitution. If you think of the Federalist Papers, I don't think, and it is unfortunately, I think, unreasonable to expect today's politicians to have anything close to that level of intellect, understanding, and kind of political program. So that's at the level of deep political principles, such as like why you need a separation of church and state. Both Madison and Jefferson have much eloquent to say about that. No politician today, if they say anything, will be just total bromides, which is not true of Madison or Jefferson. But if one level below that is having some policies that have some coherence and set some long-term agenda, so that you have some idea of what they plan to do if they stick to what they say, of with political power, but not what they'll do the next day, but what their sort of agenda is. So this is what they will be trying to do in their 4 years in office. And here, the midterms, I mean, you brought up DeSantis about the pandemic. I mean, that's at a level of a state, but obviously there was a lot of people running for Congress, and you're part of the federal government. So you should have some kind of view of how should the federal government, for instance, approach a pandemic, and what should its policies be? Not like, what do you do the next day about if someone at the CDC says such and such, well, we do this and we sideline them, but how do you approach a pandemic? And that I think of as like, it's a policy. It's not at the level of political principles, but it's not just also just seat of your pants. And I found striking, but I think this is the trend. That's part of the issue, that on issue after issue, you can't look at a candidate and say what their policy is. What is their policy in regard to a pandemic? What is their policy in regard to inflation? What is their, if you ask like more broadly about Ukraine, what is their policy in regard to it? Not should we continue for the next month to send them money or arms, but what is your policy? What is your long-term vision? What are you hoping, like, what you hope is the outcome? What do you think this aid is going to do? Or there were discussions of some Republicans that they want to stop the aid. So who knows? And because who knows what their policy is in regard to this? And that, if you go for almost every issue, you can't even now at the level of a policy say this is what a person at least says they stand for. They don't even bother saying anything in regard to, even if they don't stick to it then 2 years from now. And that is, I found that it's new. So this isn't an issue of partisanship or a divide. I think a divide at the level of policy is fine. Here we have real partisanship, and people think like we're really opposed to one another. And there's no way you can discern that from their policies. You can get it like, I'm a member of the Republican Club, and I'm Democrat, so we're really opposed. But at the level of policy, you can't get it, and that is like that's part of what tribalism looks like. It's so, as they would put it, like polarized, which is not a valid term, but the way they would put it, but not about any policy.
Yeah, I think a good example of this may be the way abortion has come up in the campaigns and the positioning of different candidates, because abortion is a very concrete kind of decision. Is it going to be legal in this state? Is it not going to be legal? What should the federal position be on this? And in that sense, it, it's easier for them to take a stand on that, because then they can just signal, I'm with this camp or with this camp. It's one or the other. And then there's within that, it's how strict are you going to be about exceptions and so forth. But it's surprising how little there is discussion about, well, why would you make it legal and why would you ban it and what's the basis for that, and just the implications of it. So it, in a certain way, I'm glad it was on the agenda for a lot of voters. And what I'm seeing in some of the coverage that I think is plausible is that it became an issue for voters who are undecided, or that this became salient for them. It's like, I'm going to vote in this with this as my main issue, which is good, because I think it's an important freedom that's been lost as a result of the overturning of Roe. But it's disappointing that it's just so concretely held. It's not the question of should the woman have a right to this. It's, well, we're going to decide the particular concretes of how abortion is going to be managed in this state, and it doesn't inspire me with hope that it's going to become protected better or better understood. But it does seem like that in a number of places, voters are not happy that this has been taken away. So that's sort of a very small bright spot in this landscape.
I would say that's the issue where there's the most long-term perspective, and
Yeah.
it sticks out both for that and how precarious that is. In part, as you say, because it's basically both sides don't want to articulate their reasons for their position. They will have a position, but it has the most long-term focus because it's at least at the level of laws either being proposed or laws we would overturn, and that has long-term implications. If this is the law that we're banning abortion and there won't even be exceptions for rape and incest, that to change the law is a process, and so that has some endurance. But even there, that was the most abstract discussion, I think. And you could at least say that you're getting maybe close to a policy in regard to it. But if you contrast that with, say, inflation and the pandemic, and I think they go together, because if you don't have a view that inflation is connected to the pandemic, you're not thinking about it at all. If you think you can have millions and millions and millions of people not working, told to stay at home and so on, not producing anything, so dramatically restricting supply, and well, that won't have any impact on prices. You live in a fantasy, and that makes you unfit for even thinking about running for office. So you can't, if you're seriously saying, well, we're going to tackle inflation and so on, the idea that you can have no position on the pandemic and on lockdowns and things, and was this all wrong, and we need different policies, and we have to ensure that there's different policies in perspective, in place. And the discussion of inflation was, yeah, well, we're going to fight inflation, but where did inflation come from? Well, how are you going to fight it? It was so empty that you can't, if you ask about what their fiscal policy was, you can't, there's no answer to that. And there was no pretense of even an answer. And that's part of what I find new, that you don't even have to have a pretense of an answer to that.
So you're suggesting different ways in which this is a new development. I want to talk about how, if at all, this is new, and is it a degeneration from where we were in the past? So we can look at different elections in the past, different candidates, and what would you say in comparison? Let's go back to I wonder if we should go backwards in time or just start in 1980 and work forwards. But I think maybe it was worth going further back and moving forward, because I think that's the pattern. So Ayn Rand had a lot to say about Reagan. She did not like him. She liked him initially, and then as she learned more about him, she grew very negative and critical. And you can hear her views on him in a talk called "The Age of Mediocrity," which you can find. We'll put links to that in the show notes. But the her view of Reagan was what she objects to is the philosophy he doesn't have. I think that's I'm paraphrasing. I don't have exact wording, but it was a very profound statement. Like, it's not that he has the wrong views. Like, he doesn't have a view, and he's letting in other people sort of fill the vacuum. He's empty, and the various influences are coming in. And one of the major influences, and she faulted him for allowing this to happen, was the so-called religious right, or the moral majority. That's one of the factions within it. And that came to define Reagan's positions in a significant way. Maybe not exclusively, but it definitely some of his signature position. And ever since I remember encountering you, it was surprising to me comparing her analysis of Reagan with a favorable yet critical view that you would get from someone who's a conservative, which is Reagan is a towering giant in the mythology of the American right. People deride him as the patron saint of the conservatives. Like, he's this really principled guy, inspired a lot of people, and he's someone against whom future candidates are always judged. Is he Reagan-like? Can he muster the same kind of enthusiasm among voters? And so there's a big gap between how she saw him and how many people see Reagan. So that, I think, is telling. So she already said of Reagan, and she had other things to say about her predecessors in office, but she regarded him as vacuous. And maybe it's useful to talk a bit about why that is, and what's the implied standard here that she had.
Yeah, I think what you said is and I think you say you're paraphrasing, but I think it's very close to a direct quote, that what she objects to Reagan is the philosophy he doesn't have. And that's an expectation of that an American politician, an American president running for the head of the federal government and so on, should be operating at a level closer to Madison or Jefferson. So she would never say, I think, of Jefferson that he doesn't have a philosophy. And here it means particularly a political philosophy, a set of principles through which you're going to construct your policies that are setting the long-term direction. And that's how people saw Reagan, as he's the revival of the founding fathers and so on. And I think her perspective is, you don't have a clue if you think he's like Jefferson or he's like Madison. So that's her standard. And that's part of what I said earlier, that I've dropped that as a standard. I mean, it's sad in that sense that you have to drop that. But if you have that expectation, no politician's going to come close to it. But if you think just at the level of policy, I take Reagan over today's politicians. And that is, I think it was still right to think of him as having some policies, both bad and good. But so even something like his attitude towards the moral majority, and that like part of what we need is more religion in politics. That's completely false. It was a destruction of freedom, but it tells you a little bit of his long range orientation and that he lived up to it in some regard. I think the moral majority certainly thought he's going to pay them more attention than he did, but he certainly did some, and helped them gain more respectability, more political power. But if you think that, he came in to fight the inflation at the end of the 70s. And again, you had more of an idea. He has some policy. He sees inflation as a monetary phenomenon. He's going to bring in someone like a Paul Volcker, who what he's going to do is clamp down on the creation of money at the level of the federal government and Federal Reserve. And that's not political philosophy and political principles, but it is a policy that sets some long range direction. And the same in foreign policy. You had an idea that he views the Soviet Union as evil, and that like his policy is going to be stop appeasing them and speak more forthrightly about that they're evil, and that's how we have to deal with it. And that's there's something. So this is what I mean by a policy. It's not a political principle, but it sets some long range direction, and you can have some idea of what he's going to do if voted into power. And so many of today's politicians, I think you can't really answer that question. They're going to do with in the way their tribe swings and so on, but they don't have any policy that is ideological or intellectual, is a different way of putting it. And that, I think the contrast of Reagan, both backwards towards Jefferson or Madison, is tells you something very deep. And then fast forward to someone like take of who Republicans wanted to win, Mehmet Oz, or take Herschel Walker in Georgia. I mean, it's going to a runoff. The idea that they have any policies, they don't have any policies. And I think both of them equally could have run for the Democrats. And that's because like, there's nothing intellectual there. And I think that's it's new. It's a continuation of a trend. So in that sense, it's not new, but we're quite a bit lower than we were even 20 years ago. We could talk about sort of the turn of the century. So that's part of my perspective on it. And I think to think of part of what Ayn Rand was looking at, she's looking at it at the level of principle, but even at the level of policy, something has changed dramatically, I think.
Yeah, I think another good example is, again, someone we were very critical of when he was in office, and I'm still very critical of George W. Bush. He was in power when 9/11 happened, and he presided over the response to that in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we were scathing about George W. Bush, and I think all of that holds up. What is interesting from the perspective of having a long-term vision or longer-term vision than some of the current people in politics is, you made the point, we were talking about this previously, that one of the things we criticized Bush about was this foreign policy of what was at the time called the forward strategy of freedom, which was the idea of bringing elections to the Middle East as a solution to Islamic terrorism and forestalling future attacks like 9/11. That was and there was a certain kind of, that was a policy. I mean, you could say, well, this is going to have long-term effects. It was going to start in Baghdad and Kabul, and it was going to be a wave of democratic revolutions across the Middle East. And it was put in those terms. That was the metaphor, the wave, democratic wave. And they tried to implement it. So they took it seriously. They went and pushed for elections in Egypt, and they pushed for elections in the Palestinian territories and in Lebanon and in other places. I mean, it all went awry, and as predictable as that was, and we were making that case. But there's a way in which, as wrong as that was, there was a kind of longer range perspective that you could understand. You could point to it as, this is a direction. We're going to try this. And it was distinguished from, and this is a point I wanted to come back to, picking up on your comment about Oz and Walker. It was markedly different from the kind of policy that Bill Clinton had. Now, Bill Clinton was a big advocate of democracy promotion, but it did not look anything like what George W. Bush did. There was rhetoric about pushing democracy under Clinton, but it was very different. You could tell the other party was not advocating anything close to this. I don't think there's anyone today who has anything similar to what Bush was advocating in foreign policy. Now, just to pick up on something you said that just reminded me of an interesting observation on this issue. So you made the point just now that Oz and Walker could have easily run for the other party if the seat was open and it seemed advantageous. I noticed something similar with the positions or stands that some of the other candidates took, that it was hard to tell if you were given the just the blurb about what they stand for on a given issue, and you didn't know who the candidate was, could you actually guess who they represented and what they were going to stand for? And I think it's a good test to do that with different candidates. And the one that struck me, I was reading the page for Fetterman, and so he has a statement about making. So the headline for the statement is "Make More Stuff in America," and there's a long, for a politician's page, a long write-up about that. It's 3 paragraphs, and the gist of it is, we need to buy American. We need to force companies to build in America. We need to bring jobs back and not outsource anymore. And I finished reading that, and I thought, this reads exactly like the statements that Elizabeth Warren had when she was running for, she's trying to become a presidential candidate. But it also is indistinguishable from the position of Donald Trump, who was a Republican president. And to me, that you get this sort of convergence on particular issues. There's a lot to say about how that ends up being the case and which issues the convergence is stronger. But to me, it's evidence that there isn't really thinking about policy. This is concrete level things that, well, in my district, if I say buy American, that's going to excite people. So I'm going to say buy American. Do I really know the logic of this? Is it going to work economically? Is there any basis for? No, this is the working class district where I think I can win votes this way. Bringing jobs back, manufacturing. What's the evidence for thinking this is really what anyone should do it, let alone a government forcing you to do it? And it's concrete positions divorced from any kind of conceptual, intellectual framework for, no, I have a view of how an economy is going to be run. And instead it's this, we're going to patch this one thing that bothers you by forcing people to take this concrete action. And it's revealing that there isn't really a framework in either side who advocate this. Does that resonate with you? Have you seen that kind of thing?
Yeah, and what particularly is, I think, noticeable, or at least if it's pointed out, it should, yeah, there's something there, is it's not trying anymore. That's part of what I find, like, in terms of the trend. This is where we are now. So one of the things that I found most startling about that you showed me this prior to when we went on the air, is it starts off with fighting inflation and lowering costs, starts with making more stuff in America. Now, the whole complaint about that stuff's not made in America is we allow them to outsource to cheap labor in Asia and elsewhere. And what cheap labor means is the costs are way lower, so we can sell it at a lower price. And that's what's pricing Americans out of the market. So how can you possibly think, if we're going to require that more stuff be made in America, yeah, part of what that means is prices will go up for things that if it's not made with cheap labor. And this is how you're going to fight inflation and lower costs. And it's so, like, you're not even trying to have anything even resembling a policy. It's just, oh yeah, we're supposed to be fighting inflation, so I'll put in something here about fighting inflation. So, and if you contrast that, say, to think of some of the people who've been pushed out of politics, like a Paul Ryan from the Republican Party. I don't think it's at the level, certainly, of operating at principles, but he has a little bit of an understanding of economic policy, and he was big about reforming the entitlement state, and there's things we have to do, and has long-term projections and how it works. And whether you think he's right or wrong about that, that's what it looks like. He has some policy in regard to, like, Social Security is out of control, it's going to go bankrupt. Here, this is not even a policy about inflation. It's just, yeah, fighting inflation. That's what we're supposed to do, is I'll throw that in. And made in America, people want that, I'll do that. What's the relationship between the two? Who cares? And that's that we're not operating at the level of a policy anymore. And to go back to think of that, I think the foreign policy issue is very instructive because of the sort of the descent that we've had. So looking at this over the span of decades rather than of days in terms of how people think about the current election cycles and so on. If you're looking at the span of a decade or two, George W. Bush did not run on his foreign policy. He was a compassionate conservative, was mostly about domestic issues because 9/11 hadn't happened. And when you, it was clear at the time, but he's also said this in retrospect, is he was completely unprepared in terms of foreign policy. He didn't really have a foreign policy, hadn't thought very much about it. And then the crisis of 9/11 happened. And it's so part of what's revealing is that he felt the need to have a policy in regard to this. And it's so he was part of the people formulating it, but it was partly the neocons, partly people like Cheney and so on. But it was like we have to have some kind of policy, some kind of long range, long term direction in regard to it. This is a massive crisis and so on. And what are we going to do? And if you contrast that to the present, like think of two real crises. The pandemic, certainly, and that's a crisis at home, and so of affecting every American. And if you think of Ukraine as it's certainly a crisis in Europe, and like what is the winter going to be, and so on. And the response is not now that we have to formulate some kind of policy of how we're going to deal with this and how we're going to address this. And if you ask, like, what's the policy in regard to Ukraine and Russia, there is no answer to that. Or if you ask, what is the policy now for pandemics? There's not. It's not even like they formulated a flawed policy. That was our view of the the forward strategy of freedom as a strategy. And notice the word strategy, and as a policy, it was this is completely misguided and it's going to result in disaster, not any positives. But you could look at it in terms of, okay, this is a policy trying to set a certain direction for the next few years and so on. And we criticized it on that basis. You can't criticize the action or outlook in regard to Ukraine or the pandemic in regard to a policy or strategy because they have none. And they don't feel the need to have one. And that's part of what I find so revealing.
I want to just step back a bit and talk about how this is a trend. So you mentioned it's a disintegration or degradation over time, and I agree with that. But I think it's worth unpacking what's behind it and why is it people who vote are tolerating it. And I think there's at least those two issues to unpack. But in thinking about it, let's try to characterize a bit what this trend is. And I think a couple of things that have come up already. It's not long range. There's no conception of the long range. There's very concrete range of the moment perspective. Election cycle driven, I think, is the way people are comfortable thinking of it, but it's maybe even less. I think an election cycle has some semblance of planning, and I tend to think it's more news cycle driven, so a 24-hour cycle. So that's one feature of it. I think the other feature is very concrete bounds. We talked about the way abortion is discussed and the way, which is very tribal. And then the other example that came up, which I think falls under this heading of being very concrete bound, is, as you put it, that there's not an attempt to explain how forcing jobs back into the US is going to drive inflation down, because the logic of the economics is going to drive against that. So I think that one of the things that strikes me about this is there's one other feature that I think is worth talking about in this trend, and maybe you have others you want to raise. But in thinking about the way a lot of the candidates presented themselves, so we've argued a bit about how there's an absence of policy, there's an absence of intellectual framing of a long-term perspective. But what's really striking is the way in which they signal what they stand for. And I spent some time reading different politicians' pages. So I mentioned Fetterman. I went to Herschel Walker's website. I went to Carrie Lake. I went to various others. And it's interesting to see how they position themselves. And in the absence of policy or in absence of any sort of conceptual longer range perspective, what there are is sound bites, I think, the best way to characterize them. Things that you can read in one go. It's a couple of sentences. Doesn't really tell you what they will do once they get into power, except some general statements that sound like what the party position might be. But the aspect that really leapt out at me is the so for the particularly Republican candidates, it's I'm endorsed by Trump, and I'm going to be an Arizona first politician because I'm in line with America first, and it's sort of replicating if there's a playbook for Trump or just some of the features of Trump's approach to politics, as that's a big source of the value that I represent. And I think that that's definitely true with Lake, and I think it's somewhat true with Walker. It's not really clear what he stands for. And to me, that is highly tribal. It's I'm part of the Trump class, the Trump group or the club, or have you they think of it. And in the run up to the election, which we haven't talked about, and this would be we touched on this in the Georgia context, but there's a lot of concern about candidates who were running on the claim, reiterating the claims about election fraud. Election was stolen in 2020, and will it be stolen now? So to me, the feature that really is highly characteristic of what we're seeing is associating yourself with what you think your tribe members like, which is for the Republicans, it's I'm with Trump. And if you want to attack your opponent, it's not my opponent doesn't have a coherent policy. It's my opponent is a mini Biden, and we all hate Biden, so don't vote for my opponent. And this came up in the Oz campaign too. He's a big part of his attack against his opponent was he's aligned with Biden. You don't like Biden, don't. And that is, it's not an argument, and it's sad that that's how it's insulting to the people voting, and it's revealing of a lack of any attempt to present some actual position.
Yeah, and it's the part of the tribalism, and that it's more explicitly tribal. Is I think for some time both the Republican and Democrats, and more broadly, kind of conservative, liberal, progressive, have been more tribal, but there was still some felt need to couch it in more intellectual, ideological terms. That what unites us is some set of shared ideas. And now it's much more what unites us is we like the same people, or we live in the same area, and even a little bit of we have the same color skin. And it's so the absence that what we stand for is some ideas. That's what, and it's the absence of that, and the felt need to not even that, so no longer a felt need to cover up that absence. Like there's something defective about that, and we have to pretend that we have more of a policies and an ideological position than we actually do have. And the it's part of it. It's a focus on personalities then, and the personality of your opponent. So when you put it, there's no argument. It's there's not a debate really about any ideas. And I watched a lot of NPR in the run. I normally do listen to the news NPR a lot, in part because they allow politicians and strategists for the Republicans and Democrats to talk a little bit more. It's not all sound bites. The interviews are a little longer, and they give people a little more space to talk. And so it was incredible how empty of any ideological position. We're not Trump, and we believe in elections, or we think they were stolen. That's not anything in terms of setting a political direction. Now, I would vote against any of these election deniers and the people who think you don't need any evidence to assert things, and you can make the most baseless accusations and should somehow still be taken seriously. But that's just like, that's such a low bar that, okay, we're not going to vote that in. I want to vote, and this was a point Ayn Rand made. You're voting for representatives. You don't and can't know what is going to happen in government You can't know there's a 9/11 that's going to happen. You can't know a pandemic. There's all kinds of things you can't predict and think in terms of representatives at that concrete a level. The only way you can think of it as they're representing my interest is at the level of ideas and ultimately at the level of principles. And this is why I think she thought once principles disappear, there's a way in which representative government is disappearing because you don't actually know what you're voting for. You don't have an idea that if they live up to what they're saying, this is what they would do. But as I say, ultimately you need principles, but you need at least policies to have an idea. Okay, this is how. If you take the forward strategy of freedom, if another 9/11 emerges, or there's terrorist attacks in Europe, as happened after 9/11 and so on, it's okay. This is how this person's going to think about it, and he's probably going to double down on his forward strategy of freedom, and that tells you, okay, that if I'm electing him, this is what he's going to do. And that's to have a representative form of government. That's what you have to be able to do. Both the elected officials should be trying to articulate things at a level of policies and principles so that you know where he stands and you know for concretes that come up, which are not, you can't anticipate or know, okay, but this is how he would approach it. And that's what you can't do anymore. So like what the people voted in now and there's another pandemic, what will they do? I have no idea. No idea what they will do. And the idea then that they're representing me, like how do you pick a representative when you have no idea what they will do?
I wanted to talk a bit about, I'm interested in your thoughts on why people accept this. And maybe we should question the premise of that question, because the more I think of it, the more I wonder if it's the right question. But just to step into the trend one more time, how do you think of the trend? So we traced it from before Reagan and since Reagan, and there's definitely a trend that predates Donald Trump. So I think the natural thing for people to think is, oh, Donald Trump is the exclusive source of this, and I don't think that's true. I think maybe he amplified it, maybe he normalized certain kinds of behavior that weren't common in the past. I think that is definitely true, but I certainly don't think he's the source of it, and because we've seen it predating him. How do you think of the fundamental driver behind this sort of anti-intellectual trend, or how do you characterize it?
Well, I mean, that is one characterization of it, that there's a growing anti-intellectual trend in America, and for understandable reasons. That this is something Ayn Rand talked about a lot, that the left, the pro-socialism, pro-collectivism side has lost its moral fervor and moral certainty. That the bankruptcy of socialism, of collectivism, was clear by the 70s, let's say. I mean, I think it was earlier than that, but by the 70s, it's clear. It's part of that there was this kind of mood in the country of the need to have a swing to the right. And that's part of how it was put. It's that, like, this has failed. It was a crusading ideal, or had that at least PR, that it was presenting itself as a crusading ideal. And if you think of the 60s and the counterculture and it's like, we're the voice of the future and the new ideal and so on. And that was shown to be a disaster politically. But it dates further back into World War II and the rise of collectivism and its failure. But so this is part of why she was so anti-Reagan, I think, that what a swing to the right, what it would look like and what it needed to be to have long-term positive impact is, okay, so we've had this kind of moral and intellectual crusade on the side of collectivism. Now we need it on the side of individualism and freedom. And that's part of how the sort of the PR around Reagan was trying to say that's what he is. And her view, I think, was that he is not that. He's not anything like that. And to associate what it looks like to have a moral crusade for on the side of the right is Reagan and the so-called moral majority. I think Ayn Rand's comment was they're neither. They're not moral and they're not a majority in the country. And it was in part a PR campaign in the same way it was for the New Left to exaggerate what their attraction was to the rest of the country. But that's so you have then Reagan presented as this is what it looks like to be sort of moral crusader on the right. Who wants that? Who wants the moral majority? And that's part of what pushes in an anti-intellectual direction. Now, on both sides have an awareness that, and the awareness, unfortunately, is true that we're not actually intellectual. I mean, the idea that the New Left was intellectual, the counterculture with its drugs and the hippies, has nothing, has no connection to the intellect, and the moral majority has no connection to the intellect. So this is part of that. It's a long-term trend of emptying the American politics of any real intellectuality. I think it is a longer term trend, but where we are now is new. And I don't know what your perspective is. I know you have a non-US perspective because you're an immigrant, so am I, coming from Canada. And I can remember thinking in the 90s that as bad as American politics is, it's better than in Canada because they talk more about ideas and ideologies than any political party in Canada does. And to just give an example from Canada, we had a party called the Progressive Conservatives. And like what they stood for and how the hell you think you can put these two things together and so on. Nobody really cares. That's part of the, and in the US, it seemed like there's still a level of discussion of politics at the level of ideas. And I no longer feel that. I no longer feel there's any kind of contrast like that in regard to Canada and the US. And that's the emptying of it, of ideas. I think it's not that Canada's gotten better. It's
Yeah. Yeah. I'm reflecting on what my impression was, and I think it was similar in that the UK scene, when I was tracking it and living there was a strong convergence to this, what they regarded as the center, and there are certain issues that nobody challenged. So the prime one is the National Health Service. That's just untouchable. No party is willing to really go against that, and every party is going to campaign to align with that. And it was very small differences between the two major parties, and it was hard to distinguish who was where. It definitely struck me that there was I don't know that I would have characterized as anti-intellectual, because I think when I was tracking politics at the time in the UK, I didn't have a very sophisticated view, but I definitely got the sense that it was un, undistinguished, and they were different. You could tell people apart mainly by just personalities, and I think that's sort of the sort of tribal perspective that is seen here. Yeah, I mean, today's conversation has definitely underscored the way in which the political scene in the U.S. it's really declined in the time that I've lived here. So I remember you mentioned George W. Bush. I remember being incensed at his platform of compassionate conservatism. I remember trying to write articles about this and his whole approach to it, and thinking, well, it's a new riff on conservatism, and what's really new here, and this is really not at all compatible with freedom. Who's putting anything comparable to that today? I don't see that. But I do want to raise one other point to talk about it, and it's not exactly a counter argument or a counterpoint, but I think it's relevant to try to integrate this, because if the general trend, and I think I agree with this, the general trend is anti-intellectual. It's empty of substance. how do we think about, how do we integrate that with at least two kinds of phenomena that we see in the culture? One is, I think there's a uh, strongly assertive and maybe newly assertive religionist camp. And I think especially after the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe, I think that energized them, because that was something they had been campaigning for many, many years. So one way to look at them is, well, aren't the conservatives or the religionists, maybe that's a better way to characterize them, the religionists in the political scene, can we say that they're ideological? They have a long-term vision? Because in a certain way, fighting to overturn Roe for 50 years, I mean, there's some kind of vision there. It's horrible and it's really destructive, but there's something. And then on the other side, it was interesting that neither of these two were particularly salient this election cycle, but the kind of progressive that AOC represents, and before her, Bernie Sanders. So there's sort of the people who describe themselves as socialists or democratic socialists or qualified, but they're much more in recognizably socialist than other people in the Democratic Party. How do you think of those? Because I mean, at first blush, they do look like they have more of a long-term perspective. If you think about the Green New Deal, it's like, we're going to overhaul the entire economy, and nothing's going to be left untouched. And the religionists are basically, we're going to bring religion back, and religion needs to dominate, politics is subservient to it. And that's their vision. So how do you integrate those?
Yeah, I don't think of the religionists as long-term vision in really. So there is a long-term perspective, but it's a concrete bound vision that they want to endure over time. But this is part, like, it's a dogmatic perspective. But dogma, you can have a perspective of, yeah, this dogma should rule for centuries and nobody should ever question anything and change anything. So it has that semblance to it, but it's completely accidental, I think, in the end. And a real religious mentality, it's not about the content of the religion. And this is part of, I mean, this is obviously a widespread phenomenon, and it tells you something very deep about religion. That it's, well, everybody expects, if you got the parents of Muslims, the kid and so on will grow up Muslim, and if a Christian this and a Protestant that, you'll just repeat what was there, and it's completely accidental that the content of your thing is this version of Protestantism, or it's Catholicism, or it's Islam, and this version of Islam. So, and that tells you that what it's functioning is that there's not a view that this is intellectual content for which you can think, like, is this really true and is this false? And so why would there be that kind of alignment? And this is the sense in which the content's accidental. And I think in the end of religion then is, it's a more sophisticated form of tribalism, but it's a tribe. A religion is a tribe that we all say the same things and hold the same dogma, and we're going to do this from now to eternity. And even when you look at the issue of abortion, it's not true that this was a major issue for Protestants when you go back in American history, and you don't have to go that far back. So, and it becomes one, and they're told then this is what to do, and this is what our dogmas are. And okay, that's what our dogmas are, then we'll do and we'll follow that. And so, and if 40 years from now someone comes along and says, no, our dogmas actually are different, they'll follow that. And that's the sense in which it's following an authority. And in that way, I think one should think of Trump and the Trump phenomenon as akin to religion. They're following an authority, and he knows that. That's part of what's interesting about it. It's, yeah, I could tell people that I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and I could continue to have this support and so on, because the support's attached to the person, not to any ideas, convictions, intellectual content. I think the Sanders AOC are a bit different phenomenon. They're sort of the last vestiges of having some semblance of an ideological position. And part of what's interesting about what is going on, what I think for the Democrat Party is, they can neither embrace it nor really resist it because they don't have any countering ideas to it. They don't have any opposing ideas. They can't say that it's wrong, yet they don't want to support it. And they have some idea, which I think is correct, that they can't win on this platform. Americans are still rightly too suspicious of this form of collectivization, both of socialism, but of the kind of environmentalism, which I think of as another secular religion, of taking over things. So it's but there, when you listen to Sanders or an AOC, they're a little more intellectual, I think, than say a Herschel Walker. But it's sort of the last vestiges of that in politics. I think that's how I think of it.
I just want to come back to the questions. I think the premise of the question is probably wrong, which is why do voters accept these standards? So I think the premise assumes that the voters are somehow isolated from the rest of the culture and uninfluenced by all the other wider sort of intellectual trends and education. So it's hard to imagine someone going through the standard educational system and having a better, just by default, having a better view of what politics needs to look like, and that what policies should look like and what to expect. So in other words, to have higher standards for what politicians should be presenting. But there's something there. I think there's something about. I think voters in some ways are. I mean, it's hard to believe there are people who are taking this whole issue seriously and who do I want to represent me, and who feel 100% encouraged and thrilled about the candidates on offer. So I think there's definitely, this was true in 2016. A lot of people said they held their nose and they voted for the least worst candidate that they thought was on the ballot. And that's a common feature, that people don't look at politics like, yes, I'm fired up by this politician. This is, and leaving aside the Sanders phenomenon, which had some of that flavor to it. But there is something here that I wonder what explains it. So I guess I'll reform the questions. What do you think about the voters' perspective? Is there anything to say about how they fit into this?
Yeah, so I think it's right what you said, and I agree with the idea that you can't isolate them from the culture, as though like the politicians somehow come from some place and the voters come from some. They're educated in the same places, and they read the same newspapers, and they watch the same entertainment and so on. So that they're not in that kind of different category. But I do think still in America, if we say, if you take kind of Nixon, the silent majority, there is still that phenomenon. And it might be that in some ways it's more pronounced. So some of the political analysis, both of this midterms and a bit more widely of what's been happening recently in the US, I find plausible, which is that the way the parties are working right now, the primaries and the base are getting the more fringe candidates. That is, candidates who resonate less with the wider American population, and that's part of that. People are disenchanted by politics, and when they're voting, it's voting against something. I can't imagine this guy in power, so I'm voting against him, and they might not even know that much about the other candidate and so on. I think there is something to that. And even like if you think of the part of the Democrat strategy, which I found so cynical and indeed evil, that it was, we're going to support in the primaries who they regarded as the more fringe candidates, election deniers, and so on the premise that people won't vote for them, so it'll be easier for us to get elected. And I suspect part of that strategy actually worked. But to just employ that as a strategy and and then to simultaneously have a message of we're going to lose our democracy if these people get elected, which was part of their message. And the idea that if you really think that you could help them get to that they're on the vote, that they might get into power, and you think you're going to lose their democracy if that. But there is that dynamic of, I think, on both parties, that it's pushing candidates who are less in tune with the wider American population. And I think that's partly reflected in these midterms, and part of what people were surprised by, which is that there wasn't what they called a red wave and so on. And that's because these candidates on both sides don't represent Americans. And so it is an interesting question. And this was part of Ayn Rand's view of Reagan. She thought, so again, part of why I think she was so opposed to him, she thought, I think, that a candidate who actually talked about the issues in terms of policies and principles, and who was genuinely on the side of freedom and individualism had a chance. Like, this part of the swing to the right was the population and the citizenry want something different. And so it's hard now to say exactly what it is, like, where I find it hard to think, like, where is the American public in that regard. But I think they're certainly better than and have better views than many of the candidates who are on the ballot and for election. And that's partly reflected in the results of this. So it's, if we had some better candidates, would they have a chance of being elected? I think in the wider general election, yes. Can they get from the primaries to that? So if a Paul Ryan was on the ballot, I think he would have been elected in many places. Could he get to be the representative of the Republicans in a certain district? That's much harder. But that's part of what's happened in terms of just the kind of the more immediate dynamics of how the parties are working, that I think it's right to think that this is a real problem.
So I want to come back to you in just a sec to get any final thoughts you have or suggestions. And we have some resources we can encourage people to take a look at. I just want to take a moment and thank those of you who are on the chat. We didn't get a chance to answer your questions, but we appreciate your support in the super chat, and we appreciate your listening and watching us during the live stream. Thank you for your support. And we have a few resources, but before we go to that, Onkar, any final thoughts or suggestions? Or I think the question many people probably listening are asking, well, is there any positive hope, or what do we do with this? That's a common question we get.
I think to go back to what we talked about near the start, I think it's important, and maybe it's now more important than ever, that if you see a decent politician, to support them. And it doesn't matter what side. So don't think like I have to vote all Democrat or all Republican. Vote if you see anyone who's half decent, they require support. And the way in which you've seen, I mean, and it was, again, we were critical of Romney and Paul Ryan, but I take them any day over who we have now. And if they don't actually get some support and people vote for them, and it's part of how they get pushed out. And so that's to say that I mean it very sincerely. I was really glad to see that Kemp won over Stacey Abrams in Georgia. I think he deserved to win, and people should have supported him. So it's not just wait for the ideal candidate who's not going to materialize in the press. It's still, there are nevertheless better or worse, and maybe now more than ever, it's important to support the better candidates, even if they have a lot of flaws and so on, and to think carefully about that, and then to vote accordingly.
Okay. Well, let's draw a line there. We've reached our time. Let's share a few resources with everyone on some of the topics we talked about. So, The Age of Mediocrity by Ayn Rand is a Foothold Forum talk that you can listen to, and we've put a short link on the screen for you. We'll put it in the show notes as well. It's a really powerful talk. She talks about Reagan, the relationship between Reagan and the religious right, and some of her really interesting analysis of what was going on. So that was from early on in his time in office. Let's see. I think we also talked about abortion, and we can strongly recommend a book that Ben Baer put together. That is, you can find it on Amazon. The book is Why the Right to Abortion is Sacrosanct. And there is a link on the screen to one of the essays that's in that book. It's called Abortion Should Be Legal Until Birth. And Onkar has an essay that came out, 6 years ago now, I guess, excuse me, which is One Small Step for Dictatorship. This was an analysis of the way in which the Trump campaign worked and sort of the dynamics behind it. I think it's a really powerful essay, and you can find it with the link that we put on the screen. We'll put in the show notes as well. So I think that's all we have by way of resources. And of course, you can read more of our analysis and listen to past podcasts where we covered some of these issues on New Ideal. Let me encourage you, if you're here next time, you'd like to hear a discussion, we are going to have 3 philosophers on next time to discuss Ayn Rand's philosophy, and it just so happens to be World Philosophy Day next Wednesday, November 16th. You can tune in then. And we always encourage you to send us your feedback. You can write to us, newideal@aynrand.org. We read everything. We try to respond to many. And some of the feedback we integrate into planning, and some of the topics we discuss here on the podcast, and some of the articles we publish in New Ideals. We welcome your input and comments. And finally, if you're watching on one of the social media platforms, please press all the buttons that are relevant, like, subscribe, click the bell, get notifications, and help us amplify this message and reach new people. We appreciate your watching, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.
Thanks, Elan.